Ordinarily the gloves, for instance, would be their job. They'd find them and I'd tell them there was boot polish on them, if their noses didn't. To get back to the gloves. There had to be gloves. 2 gloves. The police knew that well enough. It takes 2 hands to use an axe. But you turned up both of them for me, one after the other, and the story of the crime was right there. All, he added, with his quizzical smile, but the identity of the criminal. But as I say, I knew nothing of all this that Friday night, the second after Mrs. Lancaster had been killed, nor of Herbert Dean's reputation among the police of various cities. I did not know of Jim's wire which had brought him in a plane some 500 miles in less than as many minutes, although the police did. As a matter of fact, Mr. Dean's first visit on his arrival had been to the commissioner. That had been on Friday afternoon, after he had heard Jim's story. What I would like to do, he said, is to look over the lay of the land for a day or two, before even your own fellows know I'm on the case. If that's all right with you. Anything's all right with me, Dean. We're in a hole over this case and it's falling in on us. It's sink or swim. And having thus neatly mixed his metaphors, he inquired as to how Herbert Dean proposed to go about it. I'm taking a job in the Wellington house. The story's somewhere along that crescent, Blake. It has to be. And maybe the servants will talk. Which last reveals an optimism not justified by the facts. Our servants may have talked among themselves, almost certainly they did. But never did they more than pass the time of day with Mr. Herbert Ranchester Dean, expert criminologist and for a few days what he called gentleman's gentleman and cook butler to Jim Wellington. But I knew nothing of this when, the glove carefully wrapped in a bit of old newspaper, Mr. Dean slipped out the kitchen door like a shadow, and I closed and locked it behind him. It was not until I got upstairs that I became uneasy. After all, I had only this man's word that he was working for Jim, and that vague recollection of having seen him there once on the porch at a party. It was well after 12 then, and from that time until almost 2 in the morning I simply walked the floor, uncertain and wretched. It was 2 by my clock when I finally undressed, put out my light and went to a window to raise the shade. I was in that state of exhaustion which makes sleep a remote thing, and so I stood by the window for a moment or two. Beneath me lay the two gardens, the Lancasters and our own, and that strip of lawn where Eben had been mowing the grass when Miss Emily had run shrieking out of the house. Between the two properties is a thin line of Lombardy poplars, slim and graceful, and suddenly a movement among them caught my attention. There was a man standing there, close to the trunk of one of the trees and rather behind it. As I stared down, he left his hiding place and sliding from tree to tree began to make his way silently and more rapidly than it sounds toward the rear and no man's land. When he had left the poplars, he abandoned all caution and commenced to move rapidly toward the rear. Who he was, whether tall or short, heavy or lean, I could not tell. I stood by the window, stunned with astonishment. Before me was the Lancaster house, shrouded in trees save for that side entrance and for the roof which rose above them. It was dark, except for the faint light in Mr. Lancaster's bathroom which he always kept on. Only when my eyes traveled to the roof did I see anything unusual, and then my previous astonishment turned to real alarm. There was another man up there. A figure, anyhow. It was not erect. It was crawling on hands and knees, slowly and cautiously, and now and then it seemed to stop and to peer over the edge to where the mansard of the third floor ended in a gutter. There was something so deliberate and dreadful about the whole thing, outlined as it was against the moon, that at first I could scarcely move. Then at last I got myself under control and rushing down to the telephone, called the Lancaster house. It was Emily who answered, her voice heavy and thick with sleep. "What is it?" she said. "It's Louisa Hall, Miss Emily." "Good heavens, Louisa. Is anything wrong?" "I've had a sleeping powder, and I just got to sleep." "Listen, Miss Emily. Please don't be frightened, and don't make a noise or anything." "I think there's someone on your roof." "On the roof?" she said dully. "Are you sure?" "Yes. He must have used a ladder to get there." "If you'll waken someone and take away the ladder you'll have him trapped, and I'll get the police." She made no immediate reply. She seemed to be standing there, undecided and heavy with whatever narcotic had been given her. But at last she spoke again. "I can't believe it, but I'll tell Margaret." She did not even hang up the receiver, and I wondered what had happened. Then I heard the sound of her rather heavy footsteps in the hall, and knew that she was on her way to call Margaret. When I went back to look at the roof, the figure was gone. Perhaps through the open windows it had heard the shrill sound of the telephone bell. Indeed, now I think there is no doubt of it. Anyhow, that part of the roof which I could see was empty, and when I had reached the street and located the officer who was still on duty around the Lancaster house, we could find no sign of any ladder whatever. The officer was skeptical. "Maybe you dreamed it, miss,"